Welcome to the Brave Women at Work podcast. This is your host, Jen Pastikas. I'm so glad you're here. With the Brave Women at Work podcast, you'll get the resources and tips along with real-world stories and humor to empower and inspire you to take bolder and braver actions in your career and life. All right, Andrea, welcome to Brave Women at Work. How are you today?
I am great, Jen. Thanks so much for having me here today.
Of course, of course. So I always start because I love women's stories and everyone's got a different one, as I kind of talk to so many women. I just actually crossed over Andrea a little over 200 episodes and it's been so fun. It's been a great journey to get to know so many women. So why don't you share a little bit about you and the work you do and how you've gotten to where you are today?
Sure. So I today am an executive speakers coach, a thought leader coach, an entrepreneur, but my journey certainly didn't start there. I started my career many, many, many years ago, far more than I would like to admit, as working in marketing and advertising, I started actually in the not-for-profit world as a fundraiser, and loved doing that. But the challenge with being working in the not-for-profit world is that you're always trying to do so much with so little. And I had the opportunity early on in my career to jump over into advertising and made that leap thinking, well, now here's a place where there's lots of money being spent and I can actually create some impact, actually do some work that's good for the world as well as good for the client. And so I went into the world of advertising, this idealist, really sort of wanting to
Mm.
help the world and use this powerful medium of advertising in service of the things that we want to do. And knowing, of course, that advertising is a selling medium. And, it turned out I was actually pretty good at it. I spent almost 25 years in advertising, starting off on the client service side, working with many large brands, and then eventually progressing into brand strategy, becoming a vice president of strategy and planning for large agency networks. And, in that work, what I was doing was becoming more and more and more aware of consumers and the ways in which we make buying decisions and how we do that. And as I got older and wiser and could see the writing on the wall in terms of my ability to create the impact that I wanted to make. And I remember it really hit me the year I was about to turn 50. And I was
Mm.
looking, at my own life, as I think we all do when we have these milestone birthdays, and looking at my own life and thinking, where from here, the goals that I had set for myself as a young woman coming into the workforce, have a career, get a big job, get the big title, get paid well, have a family, get married, buy a house. Like these are all the things that I think so many of us, sort of come in with these vague, if not specific goals. And when I looked back at my life at 50, I realized I'd done it all. And I thought, well, where from here? I've got fewer years ahead of me than I have behind me.
Mm.
And I really want to make an impact in some way. What is the footprint that I've left on this planet? And I hope it's a good one. And and so I started doing some soul searching. And one of the first things I realized was that idealist that came into the advertising world was still alive and well. And she was now very much in a capitalist world, and it did not fit who I was. And I knew I had to leave, but I didn't know what I could do. And so I started looking around. I did some volunteer work, and eventually I found myself hired as a speakers coach for TEDx Toronto. Now, I
Mm.
didn't even know what a speakers coach was at the time. Had never heard of it, but my whole job, I was a vice president of strategy for a large agency, which meant that I did consumer research. I was presenting in front of clients constantly. And I thought, this TED thing. I mean, I love TED. I've watched many TED Talks. I'm sure with a little bit of training, I can do it. But here was the thing that happened for me was my first year working with TED speakers changed my view of everything. because
Hmm.
here I was working with individuals who were literally changing the future. They were scientists and academics and technologists and even artists who were creating things that I had never even heard of. And when I looked at what they were creating and the impact that it would have, I thought, why don't I know? I work in advertising, for God's sake. It's a medium that you have to know a lot about a lot in order to do the work I was doing. And yet I didn't know these things were happening. And I thought, the thing about it is when you look at speakers or academics or technologists or entrepreneurs who are doing this kind of work, they don't get profiled. They don't get profiled because it's not bad news. It's good news.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
And the reality is, we all need more good news and we need bad news. But our news media doesn't like to give us good news because it's just not shocking enough. And so I started working with these individuals and really seeing my whole world change. And I realized that I had a skill I didn't know I had. The work I'd been doing in advertising for 20 plus years had trained me to be this to have this ability to be able to conceptualize very complex information and synthesize it down into very simple ideas. And this was what these incredible individuals needed in order to take their life's work and turn it into a 15-minute TED Talk. And
Mm.
so
Mm-hmm.
this marriage was born, and I went on to work for the next almost 5 years on TEDx Toronto, and I was a volunteer and loved it and continued to work in advertising. And I think after about my fourth year, I made the decision to take a sabbatical and did a bunch of things. And as I was, getting ready to come back into the workforce, because the money eventually runs out. And I was like,
Mm-hmm.
all right, I got to go start earning a living again. And I didn't know what I was going to do. And at the time, I was a director of curation for TEDx Toronto. And one of my speakers coaches, who I had brought on board and trained, said, "You're really good at this. Why don't you do this?" And I said, "That's not a job. This is just something you did." No, it's an actual job. I'm like, no, no one would ever pay me for that. Oh, they will. And so I took the plunge into becoming an entrepreneur and I opened Talk Boutique for the reasons that I said earlier. I wanted to help these incredible people, not only those who were on the TED stage, but also for those who didn't make it. Every year we would get over 1,000 applications for about 10 spots on stage. And it wasn't that the 990 that didn't make it weren't qualified. It's just that they didn't fit our criteria for whatever reason. And when I opened Talk Boutique, I wanted to create a way for those who are creating impact, who are doing the work and are so busy doing it that they're forgetting to tell us, all the rest of us, about it. And I wanted to do that for them, but I also wanted to do it for all of us because changing the social narrative is necessary. We need more hope in our lives. We need to see the work that's really being done, the good work by these incredible, passionate change makers and experts who are actually changing the world, but they needed help. And so my company was really designed initially to help those who had a message that needed help to transform it into something that was understandable. And today we've taken that even a higher level and we work with individuals, we work with corporate leaders, we work with all of the, those people who fit that TED profile, and we help them to transform into thought leaders. But thought leaders who aren't leaders of industry or leaders of countries or leaders of companies, but thought leaders who have diverse thinking that the world needs to see. And they may be your school teacher, or they may be the person who is decoding the genome. It doesn't matter what they're doing. What it matters is that they have something to say in the world that's different from what we're being told. And by doing that, they're adding their voice to the collective that is actually defining the future we're all going to be living.
So, one of the things that you on your site, Talk Boutique, and the whole company is about storytelling. And I just wanted to know because we don't grow up, right, in schools. We don't go and take storytelling classes. We take speech class. So, what is the difference between storytelling and delivering a traditional speech? Because folks listening may not know.
Yeah. So when we deliver a speech or a presentation, let's say, typically it looks something like this. You open it up by introducing yourself. Who are you? You credentialize, this is what I've done. This is why I'm smart or why I'm an expert in this topic. Then you go on to the middle of that presentation where you start to talk about the things you want them to know. You give them a whole lot of information, and then you close that talk with a closing. Now, sometimes it's really abrupt. Some people just end. Sometimes it's a summary of what you just told them. And then it's that complete beginning, middle, and end. That's what we're
Mm-hmm.
taught is a talk, a presentation, but that's not actually a story. The problem with that is while for you as the speaker, you've probably prepared, you've probably done the work, you know all the things you want to say, and you've done it in a way that makes sense for you, but it's not about you. It's about the audience. And in some way, you've got to be able to keep that audience engaged because we are competing for everyone's attention right now with, weapons of mass distraction.
Mm.
Telephones, they sit in our cell phones sit in our pocket and distract us 98% of our day. And how do you compete with that? Well, the way you do it is with brain science, and
Mm.
storytelling is the way in which we work with the brains of our audience and keep them engaged. You see, what story does is it keeps us engaged because our brain is both associative and predictive. Now, I'm going to come back to that because I want to answer your question of what's the difference. So, when you're doing a talk or a presentation that actually is a story, what you're doing is you don't start off with all about me. I start off with a story. Now, that story could be about me, and it could be credentializing me in a way that I just did, where you got to know a bit about my background. Now, I told you a story. But if I was telling you a story at the opening of a talk, I would have purpose built that story to hold the idea that I want you to remember. Now, that idea is the one thing I want you to take away. I don't care if you remember it, anything else about my talk. I want you to take that idea away. So I would have built a story around that idea. And so as I'm bringing you into the story, what I'm doing is I'm laying little breadcrumbs down for you that you don't even know are there yet, but I'm putting them down for me as places to come back to. I eventually get to a place in the story where you are emotionally engaged. It's a tension point in the story. I'm finding a place in that story that I've built very purposefully so that I can now deliver my idea and make that story almost a metaphor for that idea. And then I'm going to go on to do the rest of my presentation, which I have built in three specific chunks. And those three chunks are related to that core idea. In fact, they're the unpacking of it. And now what I'm doing is I'm going back to that story, to some of those breadcrumbs that I've laid down, and I'm bringing the story all the way through my talk. And I'm relaying the talk through the key messages that are related to that core idea so that you remember the core idea. And I know you will because I've used brain science, because story, as I said, is associative and predictive. And when I tell you the story with my idea inside of it, you remember the story, which means the idea goes along with it. Because from what we know from brain science is that when you tell a story, 60 to 70% of the facts within that story are remembered. Now
Mm.
imagine that's your corporate presentation or the talk that you're giving on a stage. How much of it do you think that somebody remembers without story? 10, maybe 20% of it, maybe lucky.
Yeah,
But
exactly.
story, imagine 70% of what you've said. And now they start telling other people. They're doing your job for you. So storytelling, not only is it powerful, but what you're doing is you're purposefully building it around your idea. I call that idea-centric storytelling.
You make it sound so beautifully easy, but not everyone knows how to do this, right? Of course, they can come to you. We're going to include all of your links in the show notes, of course. But wanted to ask, what are the baby steps? Like, what are that foundational building blocks? If someone is used to very informational presentations, they've been in corporate, short, medium, or long term, it doesn't matter. We're not trained to storytell in corporate. We're
Not at
trained
all.
to, give me the facts, ma'am, give me the facts. And it's not super interesting. And therefore, you've just explained it may be forgettable. It's not memorable. So, what would be the initial steps for someone to dip their toe into the pool of storytelling?
So the first thing, whenever I start working, and I work with a lot of corporate leaders, and this is something I teach all the time about how to give your corporate presentation like a TED Talk. And in fact, one of the things that I want your listeners to all have is our storytelling toolkit. So, but what you do, the first thing you do is you've got to figure out the idea. What is it you want to convey? What is this presentation conveying? And that's the most important thing that you can do actually before you sit in front of your computer. I just gave this presentation last week to a group of corporate leaders. And I said to them, okay, what's the first thing that you do when you're getting ready to write your presentation? Of course, what do? They sit down in front of a computer and they open whatever presentation software they're going to work with, right? And I'm like, no, what you're going to do is you're going to take a pen and paper. And the first thing you're going to do is you're going to write down what is it you want your audience to take away. And we have a framework for that. That's what we call the idea framework. And it's comprised of really three things. Very simple. It's a what, how, and a why. The what is your topic. The how is what you uniquely, how you uniquely address that topic. So your what and your how are really make you different. The why is where you meet your audience. It's the impact or the outcome of that idea. So when you put it together, a what, a how, and a why, you have an idea. And what I like to do is to turn that into one sentence. And I use a little framework which says, today I'm going to talk to you about what, and I'll show you how, because why. And that's a framework. You don't necessarily say it in that way in your presentation because it sounds pretty staid and boring. But when you're writing your idea, it's really helpful because you can hear it said out loud. And that's important too. Write it down in that framework, give it to somebody, and ask them to say it to you. And here's why. Because when we hear it in our head, this brain of ours that's incredibly smart and has got all the answers is filling in the blanks that your idea may not be hitting on. So you're hearing it and you're like, yeah, that's exactly what I want to hear. But when somebody says it to you out loud, your brain is now hearing it as if it's theirs, not yours. And it's no longer filling in the blanks. And so you hear your own idea said in a way that you start to hear the parts of it that are not clear. So it's important. So you start with your idea, write that idea. Now you have an idea. Now look at that and go, what does that represent? Is that a transformation? Is that a revolution? Is that is it a reveal? What is it? What does that idea represent? Now, where in my life have I had something like that happen to me that I can build a story that leads to that idea? So this helps you. And it might be in your life, it might be in your work, it might be, I'm working with a corporate leader right now who's about to do a board presentation. And so he's got a very big idea that he's presenting to his board. And what we did is we went to some historical context. We said, what's a story out there in the business world that is well known, but that can hold your idea? And we've done this with a lot of scientists as well, looking at something that is really impactful. And this is, sometimes as business leaders, we don't necessarily want it to be all about us. So we can use these stories that others know. And it's important that these stories have some relevance to the idea, but also to your audience. So, I remember working with a group of ophthalmologists. We did a lot of work in the ophthalmology space. And we're doing, these were surgeons who were giving surgical talks like TED Talks. And so they had 10 minutes to do a surgical talk. And I'm always reminded of this one surgeon who used the concept of Rome. Rome was built as the center of an empire, and everything always led back to Rome. And literally, we have a saying, all roads lead to Rome, right? We all know that. It became sort of a shorthand, because what he was doing was he was trying to train other surgeons when to refer to him when they saw a certain thing. So he kept giving this analogy of, he gave us the backdrop of the Roman Empire and then showed us how all roads led to Rome. And then throughout his talk, every time he showed an image, he showed us the map of Rome, showing us all roads lead to Rome.
Okay.
created this way to come back to it. So the first thing to do is have your idea. The next thing to do is find the story that you're going to use. And that story is going to be based upon the idea and what that idea represents. Now that you have that, then you build the story around it. And we have this story framework. And so the story building, the story spine, which is a framework, again, which is in the storytelling toolkit, is a 5-step framework to telling a story. And so it's meant to be simple. It's meant to get you there quickly, because what we know to be true is that you've got limited time, you've got limited attention spans, and your idea is really important. So we have to get to it. But there are certain areas that we spend more time, and there are certain things we build up so that you're engaging your audience in that predictive nature. The audience is following along, their brains are following along, trying to predict where you're going. And the thing is, you're kind of taking them a bit on left field, because they're like, why are you telling me this story when I know you're talking about this other thing? So predictive wise, we've got them intrigued. And then associative, what we're doing is we're using sensory associations. Story gives us lots of sensory associations: sight, sound, smell, taste, texture, right? So we can build those into the words we're using that create associations that actually creates memorability for what you're saying. And so we're building the story purposely to lead to the idea, using a simple 5-step framework to get you there.
I'm curious, when would storytelling be appropriate? Because people might be wondering, they're like, great, so now I have some framework. You're going to get that in the show notes. Thank you so much for your generosity with that. But they might be like, I'm a, I'm a recovering perfectionist, black and white thinker. So now I'm like, Andrea, do I have to be doing storytelling in every presentation, or is there a time and a place to use storytelling? So any thoughts on that?
So use it in every presentation.
Oh,
The thing,
wow. Okay.
if you want people to remember what you're saying, and if you're in a presentation, you do, that's why you're there, use story. Now you'll use different stories. Sometimes a story can be 3 or 4 sentences. We've all, I remember when I was in advertising, there was this is kind of the example of the shortest, most effective story ever told. And I just want to get the details right. It's something like, um, for sale, um, babies' booties never used, right?
That's so funny.
Funny. So interesting. You find, like, so for me, it made me sad, right? But see, do you see, you just built a story and what was in your mind?
Just because they're like new and I saw a new baby and like, they're pink and wrinkly. Do you know what I
Yeah.
mean?
So you saw that. I saw it that the baby had died. Right?
Oh,
So do you see how, like, right away, and like that's the thing, you're not wrong. Like, it took you to one place, it took me to another place.
and I
And
think, well, I have like, I don't know like your family situation, but I have like a 6-year-old and we watch, I think it's Boss Baby or Baby Boss. And it's like, Alec Baldwin, who's like, the baby who's talking and stuff like that. So that's why my brain's
right,
making
you
those
went to this place
associations.
of like, that baby wasn't putting those booties on, right? Like, and so it made you laugh, which I love that. Like, and in another example, just to give you this, the power of words, right? Because words matter when you're telling stories, and you don't have to have deep stories. So I could say, I met this guy and he had really rough hands. Okay, great. There's really nothing interesting there. But I can add one word and it'll change that whole story. I met this guy, he had rough, leathery hands. Do you notice
Oh,
how different
wow.
that felt?
That is different.
And so right away, we're now like, ooh, what does he do? Why does he have leathery hands? What's going on? Rough hands didn't do it because rough is not enough. Rough, leathery hands takes us
Is
to
a
a,
totally different. Yes, it gives you a whole different visual. And just so everyone's clear, because they're probably like, what is she like twisted that she's laughing about like a baby's? You said booties, right? So you were thinking of like a baby's booties. I was thinking of like a booty, like a tushy, because like
oh, oh, that's
because
so
of the
funny.
cartoon, because of the cartoon it's like, he's always like shaking his little tushy, right? So that's why I laughed. So there's double entendre too. So I think there's worthy of bringing
Oh,
that up because what you say may mean something different to someone else.
yes. Well, that's it, right? So that's why words matter. And so we can use language that is story language that creates stories. When we're talking about statistics and data, if we're just giving, last quarter we saw a 25% increase in sales, and this meant that we overachieved our goals. Or you could say something like, last quarter we saw the cartoon phenomena take off, and the merchandise was so popular, we were seeing it on every street corner, and that translated for us into an overachievement of sales. We're expecting that phenomenon to continue, and in fact what we're doing is we're now starting to build out more merchandise that will create a deeper sense of joy with the work that we're doing. Now that takes you, like, both are true. They're exactly the same thing. One is giving you the context, one is giving you the numbers. Which one do you remember? Right?
Yeah.
So when we're building out our presentations, how can you bring story into everything? And you can, when we're looking at dry statistics, or we're looking at, changing the story of our company. Everything in our world is a story. This whole world is made up. We just turned it into things, but we believe it, and we call these things facts and data, but those are just made up too in some way, because we put words on them, we create meaning for those words. And I'm just reading Yuval Harari's latest book, Nexus, and he's a historian. He wrote *Sapiens*, he wrote *Homo Deus*, and he talks about the power of Homo sapiens as storytellers. It is what created us as the top of the food chain, because we didn't look at the world through a rational lens. We looked at it through a storytelling lens. We started telling stories by drawing, images on cave walls that helped us to see each other differently. So story is powerful.
It is very powerful. So, what about folks that say, well, that's great, Jen and Andrea. Like, I'd love to tell a story, but I'm scared, or I could never do that, or they just don't have the mindset's not in the right place. So, what would you say to that person?
So mindset is a big one, and we deal with this a lot. And when we're talking about speaking in front of people, mindset is probably one of the biggest things that holds us back. And when we look at mindset, it's really about perspective. So I want you to think for a moment of a triangle. And a triangle, and we all know this, like if you define two sides of a triangle, the third side gets defined for you. That's just
Mm-hmm.
a law. So when we think of our perspective, there's three perspectives that are available to us that we get to choose from, two of which we have 100% control over. The first perspective is my perspective of me. What do I believe about myself? I'm 100% in control of that. And I can choose to go, I'm great. I can choose to go, I'm terrible. That's my choice. And we need to come to terms with what we believe about ourselves. And really, we have to ask ourselves, what's most helpful? What's serving me? Am I looking at myself as being not able to do something, or am I looking at myself as being able to do it, but maybe being a bit afraid of it? That's a very different thing. Okay. So what's my perspective on me? Now, the second perspective is the piece that is a little bit wonky that most people don't ever think about, but it's what they also have 100% control of. And that is, what's my perspective of how you perceive me? I'm also in control of that. So what's my perspective of myself? And now what do I believe that you think of me? And what that piece is the piece that trips us up so many times. Because we don't think about it consciously, we just project it. And when there is a conflict between what I believe about myself and what I believe you think of me, what happens is you now start to pick up on that, because I'm projecting it, right? I'm like, oh, I'm standing up here on stage. I know my stuff, but I think they don't think I know my stuff. Or I think they're going to try and attack me. Or I think they think I'm going to fail. Now, if that's what's going on, what do you think your audience is actually getting? They may not know you feel that way, but they feel something from you. And they're like, I don't know. I can't quite put my finger on it. Like there's something about her. I don't quite trust her
Mm-hmm.
because I'm not in congruence with myself. So I'm actually in control of how everybody who is perceiving me sees me. Because when I am choosing to show up in alignment with who I want to be and who that person is that serves my best interest. And what I mean by that is if you want to create impact in the world, well, you've got to show up believing that others can see that you will create impact in the world. And when you believe that you can create impact and you believe others see you that way, you will create impact because people will go, oh my goodness, she is really working to do something good. Let me see if I can open a door for her. Let me see if I can create a speaking opportunity for her.
Mm-hmm.
We're showing up with that belief that you're going to try and trip me up. And this happens when I work with scientists and academics because these worlds are so competitive and they feel like their audience is always trying to tear them down, which while there may be some truth in that, the reality is if you go in believing that, you're going to create more of it. So
Mm-hmm.
if you go in believing that your audience is actually on your side, it'll start to calm some of that. And those people who are trying to tear you down, either they don't show up or they know that it's not an audience that's friendly to do that. And so they start to fall away and you are able to step into yourself, not only as a storyteller, but actually as a thought leader. Does that make sense?
It does. And anyone who's heckling from the audience, that's, they call that the cheap seats, right? And it's easy to
Exactly.
sit there and you come up here, you come up here and be a thought leader. You come up and do the TED Talk. You come up and give the presentation.
And if you've done the work, which if you're in front of a room, there's, I would say, a 99% chance that you've done the work. Some people don't, but for the most part, if you're serious about it, you've done the work. If you've done the work, then you're showing up, with everything you need. Everything else, like, so many people, and I hear this all the time, oh my God, I stand up and my mind goes blank. Yes, that
Mm.
happens. And I've worked with many a speaker where that happens. And it's all in there. And so that's where, if we know that that's going to happen, if we know that that's something that happens for you, there are some things we can do to make sure that you feel comfortable. And some of it might be your PowerPoint slides. You still may have them. It's not like we're saying take them away, don't ever have anything behind you. No, that's not the case at all. What we are doing, however, is saying use those to give you what you need and to give the audience what it needs to be able to follow along. But it's not your script. So if your mind's going to go blank, what's the image that's going to bring it all back for you? We
Mm-hmm.
also look at what's that very first sentence. So if you remember nothing else, just remember the first three words of that sentence. It all comes back. These become memory triggers. And that's what we work on a lot. So, it's okay to be scared in front of an audience because that means you care. So, don't worry about that. Being nervous in front of an audience, not only is it natural, but it makes so much sense because you want to make sure that you're conveying your message in the best way possible. You care about your audience. The thing is, let's make sure that you've got the supports and the tools that help you to deliver at your best. And if it's not your best, that's okay too, because the audience will forgive you and you'll do better the next time. They didn't know what you were going to say anyway. So for them, it was the best they had seen of you. And that's great. You might know you could do better. They don't.
Yeah, like people will ask me often with this podcast, they'll say, well, what did you do to get started? I'm like, well, I went to Amazon and I bought a microphone and I plugged it into my computer and I hit record. I mean, I didn't take any classes. I just started doing it. And, if I go back and listen to the first one versus the 200th or, and then maybe, the 500th, if it keeps going and going and going, it'll keep getting better and more seasoned and ripened as I get more experience. That's how it works.
That's how it works. We call it's like an athlete, right? What do they need to do? They need to do reps. The same as speaking and presenting and storytelling. You need reps. You just got to do it over and over and over again. And the more you do it, the better you get at it. And the part of it is, this is one of the reasons I love podcasting. And I tell people all the time, like, go and be on podcasts. Don't be a podcast host until you're ready. Like, for lots of people, they're like, oh, I want to be a host. Great. Do you have an audience? Well, if you don't have an audience, you might want to gain an audience first. But even you can though, like, because that's the
Sure.
thing, is you can just plug in your microphone and start podcasting. Your audience will eventually come. But when you get to go on other people's podcasts, the great thing is they ask you really good questions. And those really good questions make you think about your own content differently. And so you get to grow and explore your own content as a podcast guest. And that's
Mm.
it's really such an amazing thing. I think we are so fortunate in the world we live in today. It has never been easier to be able to create a platform for the very messages we want to get out there in the world. When I go back to my days in the not-for-profit world, 35 years ago, like honestly, like we didn't have this. Like we were borrowing, and stealing, trying to get anyone to talk about the causes that we were doing. If we only had the, access to the type of media that we have today, like I don't know, like things would be very different today.
You made me think about this as, as a podcaster, I'm a storyteller. I never really thought of it that way, that, every week, whether it's, a conversation with you or it's always a new story, it's always something new every week. And in that it is, I am storytelling. So thanks. I didn't ever think of it that way.
Absolutely. And you are a storyteller. And not only are you a storyteller, but you're a story weaver, right? Because as a host, you're weaving together these incredible guests that you have coming on and their stories. And you're creating an environment for your audience to hear the world differently. And so you're weaving stories together through the very work you do every time you're in front of your
Hmm.
microphone asking good questions.
That's kind of cool. Learn something new today. That's why I'm here. It's, part of this work is for me, right? Selfishly as a host, as I learn with every
Absolutely.
person. Sorry, everybody.
Don't be sorry. You know what? That is the gift of being in community. And podcasts kind of are that, right?
Yeah, of
We learn
course.
from each other, and I love that, right? I love it that we're all growing and learning together. And I mean, every time I'm on a podcast, I learn something, I learn a little bit more, not only about the work that I do, but the way in which other people perceive it. And that's helpful. It's really helpful for me.
Hmm. So we've talked about some of the challenges. I just want to see if there's any others that you want to highlight. We talked a lot about mindset and fear. Are there any other challenges that you want to bring up? Like, one that is in my list is, dealing with a very analytical audience, which you talked about, briefly. But if there are any other challenges that you want to share, please let us know.
I mean, there's so many when I'm working with speakers and especially and presenters. I think in the corporate speakers are actually, it's interesting. Speakers are easier to work with than presenters. And what I
Mm,
mean by the difference between that is think of a speaker who's somebody who's on a professional stage in front of a large audience and auditorium. There are kind of rules of the road for that, right? Like, there's body language, there's gesture, there's, the way in which you build a talk. These are things that are somewhat accepted, and everybody does it a little bit differently. It's not formulaic by any nature, but the thing is, we all know what you need to know to some degree. But when we move into the realm of the boardroom, people don't
mm,
think of that as a talk, but yet it is. And I think this is the piece that if I could make an impact somewhere, this is where I would like to make an impact. I spent almost 25 years working inside the corporate world. And I can't tell you how many countless hours I spent thinking, I'm never getting that hour of my life back. Right. And, if
Amen.
and if I could help others to never have to go through that again, so that we take those boring boardroom presentations and turn them into something that not only is entertaining, but entertaining in a way that inspires us to do things differently, to change what we're doing, to see the world differently, and to see our business and our work differently. Because I think that's the biggest challenge. We stand up in front of that corporate boardroom. Maybe you're presenting a strategy. Maybe you're giving a status report. Maybe you're doing your year-end review, whatever it is,
Mm,
whatever reason you're in front of that boardroom. If you're just doing a retelling of all the things that you've kind of cobbled together, you're actually not doing anything, because anyone could do that. What is it that you bring to that world? What is the analysis? What is the review? What is the story that you're building that you want them to take away? And if you can challenge yourself to go, I get one thing that they're going to remember. So I got a year-long review. Here's all the things we did this year. What do you want them to remember? Do you want them to remember that this was a year of change and inspiration? And no matter what we did, everything came back to those two words. We knew we had to change, and we used inspiration as the guise for it. And by doing that, we created outcomes for our customers that not only entrenched them in our brand, but brought them to the next level where we are now able to understand what products we're going to be introducing next year. We're able to see the growth trajectory of the business, and we're able to predict where we're going to be 5 years from now. Now, like if that was what you were building your whole presentation around, imagine how exciting that could be. Now it's not just, hey, we did an event on, April the 12th that had 100,000 people. Isn't that great? And here are all the pictures of that event. Great. Now what? Right? If you said we did that event as a kickoff for change and inspiration. And what we did is we inspired 100,000 people to look at our brand differently. And we gave them product. That event cost us $2 million. We didn't make a cent on that event, but we saw that $2 million come back by December. Why? Because everybody that we invested in at that event was inspired by what we were doing. And not only did that $2 million come back to us, but we raised $10 million for charity. Whatever. You can see how by simply having that idea first, it changes the way you reveal the information you want people to know about. Suddenly it becomes part of a story.
Okay, so there's some really good information. I just want to boil back down for everybody to take. So I come from a teaching household, so I've always got to get it. We got to get the big idea out, and I think this is a big idea. And so I have mentioned, the annual performance review. So as we're recording this towards the end of 2024, we'll see when this is coming, but you can use this when it comes out, but you can use this at any time. So one of the things that I always recommend to my coaching clients is, please build the brag file across the year. So you're kind of like categorizing or, keeping a journal or a diary of all of your wins and your compliments and things like that. But you're upping the game on that, which is really cool. So what you're thinking is like, what is the overarching theme of the entire year? And what's the story behind all of the achievements that you've done so that when you go into your annual review, it isn't like, because when you're talking to like an executive, they don't care. It's like all these, like, it becomes this like
Oh,
real, like this
yeah.
like talking head of like blah, 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 blah. They're
Yeah.
not listening anymore. But if you can tell them like, hey, here's how I see the theme of the year. And to support that theme of the year, here are some key things that we achieved, but it all was in the spirit of whatever the theme of the year was. Like it's all like wrapped in a nice bow. They're gonna remember. And so I really want everybody listening to take a note on that because I've never shared that before. So take your kind of your smile file, take your brag file, and then wrap a story around that. And I think you'll have a much more productive and probably powerful annual review process.
I love that. And I'll add two things to it. One is at the beginning of the year, well, because we're now at the end of a year. So right now you've got that smile file or that brag file. Go through it, see what that theme is, pull the theme out, and when you're meeting with your executive, go through that theme. But when you're going into next year, start the year with a theme. Give
Mm,
yourself something that
hmm
what is it? I mean, yes, okay, maybe you're going into your year with a goal. One of the things that I always do every year, I pick a word. What's my word of the year? And
hmm
word, I'm always amazed because I pick a word and then I'm like, when I look back on the year, I'm like, wow, look at how it played itself out. And so picking something like that, whether it's a word or a theme, and then just do some writing on it. Like, what does that mean to you? Because it doesn't matter what it means to anyone else. It's just what it means to you. So that by the end of next year, when you come back to do that same thing, compare it. And you're going to find that it's interesting when you've given yourself an idea it's interesting at how the year kind of fills in the blanks for you. So this year, find the theme in the events. Next year, see if your theme will actually create the events for you.
Oh, that's cool. And let's flip it on the other side because I know there's a lot of wonderful, talented people looking for work right now, and in any year, but this year's been a tough one, right? In the last like
Yeah,
12
of
to 18
course.
months. So, what's the story of your career that you're bringing to the company, right? And I call that, I often will ask my coaching clients that are looking for roles, I'm like, why should they hire you? Like, why you? And everyone's like, just stops. And there's like all this silence. I'm like, they're buying you. They're not just buying the work you do. So you have to have, and I call it a stick the landing statement, right? Like you got to stick the landing as a gymnast, you got to stick the landing in the interview, and you got to make sure that it's memorable. So if you can weave story throughout your interview, I think you will be a memorable candidate.
Well, and really what you're touching on there is recognizing that each and every one of us is a personal brand. It's a
Hmm.
brand that we own. When I recently did my own personal brand, and the tagline that we came up with, which I actually kind of pushed against first, and then I was like, no, actually that is me, is thought provoker. That's what I
Mm.
am. And so, as I move through my own career as an entrepreneur, but also as a thought leader, my what I do is I provoke thought. I get people to think differently about the things that they're doing, the things that they're seeing, and the ways in which they're interacting. And so, if I was in a job interview, I would use that. I'm a thought provoker. If you want somebody who's going to just go with the status quo, I am not your gal, because that's not who I am. I can't be that. But if you want somebody who's going to shake things up, who's going to make you look at the world differently, well, then that's me. I'm going to bring a lot to your organization. And I think it's important that you know who you're not as well as who you are.
Okay, so everybody, there's some homework. Find your theme for the year. And if you could find like a phrase or a couple words to describe you, and we've talked about Clifton strengths, like the actual assessment, you can find out your strengths, like the core
Yeah.
innate inborn strengths. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about a descriptive something about you so that when you're in an interview, you're in a key talk, like you're just not your name or you're just not your title or your role. Like Andrea Sampson is a thought provoker. That is what she is. So, Andrea, we'll stay in touch. I've got to think about mine. I don't have one yet, so I've got to think about it.
Well, here's what
Um,
you do. Go and ask all the people who just send out an email to a bunch of people and go, just tell me 3 words that you think of when you think of me. That's it.
okay.
And then take those 3 words, distill them down, and you'll find yours.
Okay, there you go. All right, so everyone's got some work to do. I love it. Again, being in that teaching household, like, it's all about like making ourselves better, and that's the whole purpose of this show. So, thank you so much for being here today. But before we end, I wanted to ask you, what do you believe are 1 to 2 ways women can be braver at work today?
So, number one, use your voice. Don't be afraid. I think it's one of the things that as women, we forget how powerful we can be when we use our voice, use our stories, and use them in a way that helps other women. So that's number one. Number two, be yourself. Whether you can see me or not, I'm a woman with blue hair. I have many pairs of glasses. I show up many times in outrageous ways, and that's who I am. And that's not for everyone. I'm not suggesting that anyone else needs to be that. What I am saying is be yourself, all of you. And don't worry whether or not anyone else thinks it's crazy. I have a lot of people who think I'm crazy. That's okay. They're not my people. And even when I worked, it was a way in which when I worked, for in the corporate world, I've had crazy colored hair for over 20 years. And, I would show up at work and there were places where it wasn't acceptable. And I left because they weren't accepting who I was. So using your own quirks, your own uniqueness as the way in which to see where you are really meant to be is important. So show up fully, be authentic. And if they don't want your authentic self, They don't deserve you.
Amen again. Preach it, Andrea. Okay, so thank you again for being on. Where can women connect with you and the Talk Boutique?
Yeah, so check out our website, talkboutique.com. I'm very active on LinkedIn, Andrea Sampson at LinkedIn, and then the Thought Leader Academy on YouTube is also where you can check out. I do videos all the time, so I've got lots of this, and they're all free. I try and give away as much as I can. And like I said, download the Storytelling Toolkit. It's a fabulous resource. And we give it out to all of our clients. It's got our frameworks in it. It's got explanations. Use it. You will find that you will become a storyteller.